Okay, let's unpack this. There's a feeling you get sometimes when you stumble upon something ancient, something really profound, something that hints at how people wrestled with, the biggest questions maybe thousands of years ago.
Yeah, like finding an old map or
Right.
or uncovering some hidden structure.
Exactly. A structure that holds this kind of silent testimony to deep-seated beliefs.
It's more than just history, isn't it? It feels like a connection to that fundamental human search for meaning just played out across centuries.
Absolutely. And today we're taking a deep dive into a truly fascinating period in India, roughly spanning 1,000 years, from about 600 BCE to 600 CE.
A huge time frame.
Huge. It's an era when these profound new thinkers emerged, challenging existing beliefs, and when those ideas started to be etched not just onto, palm leaves, but into stone.
And our sources for this dive are, well, they're rich and varied. We've got ancient texts, Buddhist, Jaina, Brahmanical traditions.
Right.
And alongside that, the incredible tangible evidence you find in these impressive monuments and inscriptions.
So our mission, then, to try and extract the most important insights from all this. We want to understand how these world-changing ideas were born, how they were debated, written down.
And it eventually, quite literally, built into the landscape.
Exactly. We'll be focusing pretty heavily on one spectacular surviving example. The Stupa complex at Sanchi. It's almost like a time capsule of this whole era.
It really is. It's a journey through a period of just intense intellectual and creative energy.
So let's set the stage a bit. This mid-first millennium BCE. It's often described as a pivotal moment globally, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You had thinkers asking fundamental questions appearing almost everywhere.
Like Zarathustra in Persia, Confucius in China.
Socrates, Plato, Aristotle over in Greece.
And right here in India, you see these towering figures like Mahavira and Gautama Buddha stepping onto the scene.
But they weren't just appearing out of nowhere, though. It's important to remember the context.
Right. This was a time of significant upheaval in India, too. New kingdoms were consolidating power, cities were growing.
And social economic life, especially in the fertile Ganga Valley, was changing really rapidly.
So these thinkers were, in a way, reacting to that world, trying to offer new ways of understanding it, navigating the changes.
And they were doing it against this backdrop of existing traditions, especially the early Vedic tradition. We mostly know that from the Rig Veda, right? Compiled maybe 1500 to 1000 BCE.
Yeah, the Rig Veda gives us this window into an earlier world. It's full of hymns praising deities like Agni, Indra, Soma.
And these hymns were central to sacrifices. They were recited during the rituals.
Sacrifices that often had very practical goals, didn't they?
Yeah.
Blessings for things like cat, sons, health, long life. Pretty focused on worldly well-being.
Exactly. And these rituals evolved over time. They started perhaps more collective, then became more focused on the household.
And kings would sponsor these grand, elaborate sacrifices, the Rajasuya, the Ashvamedha.
Right, carried out by specialist Brahmana priests.
You really get a sense of this from the Rig Veda verses themselves. Invoking Agni, the fire god, seems key. He's the one carrying the sacrifice up to the gods.
Yes, and they're praying for very tangible things. Abundant food, wealth, offspring. And you have to remember, these hymns were composed in a very specific, ancient form of Vedic Sanskrit.
And passed down orally, generation to generation, within priestly families. Not written down initially.
But then, as societies changed, new questions started to, bubble up. We see this clearly in later texts, like the Upanishads, from around the 6th century BCE onwards.
These aren't just asking for more cows anymore. They're asking the big existential questions, aren't they?
Definitely. What's the meaning of life? Is there something after death? Is our experience now, maybe even in future lives, linked to our past actions? This idea of karma really starts to take shape.
And these weren't settled questions. They sparked intense debates, people arguing about the nature of ultimate reality itself.
Even the established sacrificial practices were being reevaluated, looked at with fresh eyes.
Like in the Chandogya Upanishad, where they're contemplating the self, this thing described as smaller than a grain of millet, yet somehow bigger than all the worlds.
It's profound stuff. Or seeing the wind blowing as a kind of cosmic sacrifice that purifies everything. These were deep philosophical explorations still happening in Sanskrit.
And these debates weren't just quiet, scholarly affairs. Buddhist texts paint a picture of a remarkably vibrant intellectual landscape. They mention something like 64 different sects or schools of thought.
An incredible number, all vying for attention. Teachers were apparently traveling widely, actively engaging each other and lay people.
Where did these debates happen?
Often in places specifically set up for discussion, like these temporary shelters called Kutagarshalas huts with pointed roofs, apparently, or just in groves where people gathered.
Sounds almost like intellectual street fights,
Oh.
where the support for a school could literally grow or shrink based on how well you argued.
It really does feel like that sometimes. And a critical point of contrast emerged here. Teachers like Mahavira and the Buddha, they fundamentally questioned the absolute authority of the Vedas. Their emphasis was different.
How so?
They stressed individual agency, the idea that you, yourself, regardless of your birth or background, could work towards your own liberation from suffering.
That's a massive shift, isn't it? Compared to a more traditional Brahmanical view, where your position, your destiny, was often seen as pretty fixed by birth, caste, or gender.
Exactly. Suddenly, the power to change your spiritual state was placed much more firmly in your own hands, through your own actions and understanding.
Now, the sources also mention other traditions from this time, the Ajivikas and the Lokayatas, but there's a bit of a challenge here, isn't there?
A significant one, yeah. We mostly know about them through the writings of other traditions, particularly Buddhist and Jaina ones. Their own original texts haven't survived.
Which means we're seeing them through the eyes of their philosophical opponents, basically, which can definitely introduce bias.
For sure. For example, the Sutta Pitaka describes Makali Gosala, associated with the Ajivikas, as a fatalist. Believing everything pleasure, pain is totally predetermined, unchangeable, like unwinding a ball of string. So virtue or penance makes no difference in his view, apparently.
And Ajita Keskambalin, linked to the Lokayatas, is portrayed as this stark materialist.
Right. Reportedly denying things like alms, sacrifice, even an afterlife, saying humans are just elements, earth, water, fire, air, space that dissolve back upon death. He supposedly called talk of gifts and afterlife a doctrine of fools.
Fascinating glimpses, but they leave you wondering, is this really how they saw themselves? Or is this just how their rivals wanted them remembered?
It really highlights that difficulty in interpreting the past when you only have one side of the story. History often gets told by the survivors or the winners of the debate.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder. Okay, moving on from those eights, let's delve into the teachings of Mahavira, the 24th Tirthankara of Jainism.
Right. Though the basic philosophy is seen as predating him, he's considered the key figure, the one who guides people across the river of existence, as they say.
What's the core defining idea of Jainism that really sets it apart? Is there one thing?
If I had to pick one, it's the profound belief that the entire world is animated, possesses life, not just animals and plants.
But even things we think of as inanimate, like stones, water.
Exactly. Stones, water, air, everything has life. And that leads directly to the cornerstone principle, ahimsa.
Non-injury.
Non-injury to all living beings. This isn't just about not harming humans, it's about extreme care to avoid harming any life form, however small. It's had such a deep and lasting impact on Indian ethical thinking.
So, if everything has life and shouldn't be harmed, how does one navigate the world? What's the path?
The path to liberation in Jainism is seen as freeing oneself from the cycle of birth and rebirth, which they believe is driven by karma, by past actions.
Okay.
And the means to achieve this freedom are asceticism and quite intense penance.
And renouncing the world seems crucial. For salvation, monastic existence is pretty much necessary.
Yes, that's the ideal path. Jaina monks and nuns take very strict vows. 5 main ones. Abstain from killing, stealing, lying, observe celibacy, and, notably, abstain from possessing any property. It's a path of radical detachment.
You see this commitment captured really vividly in some of the texts, right? Like the Prakrit Uttaradhyana Sutta.
Yes, there's this powerful story about Queen Kamalavati urging her husband, the king, to give it all up, to renounce his kingdom.
Her words are incredible. She basically tells him, even if you own the entire world, it wouldn't truly satisfy you or save you in the end. Only Dhamma, the moral path, the truth will.
She describes feeling caged by the world, longing to live as a nun, free from desire, free from attachment, moving like the wind, as she puts it, without any ties. It really underscores the urgency and the totality of their approach to liberation.
Jainism spread, didn't it? And developed a rich literary tradition.
It did, in languages like Prakrit, Sanskrit, Tamil, much of it carefully preserved over centuries in temple libraries. And we also have early stone sculptures of the Tirthankaras, giving us a visual sense of their importance from early on.
Now, if we talk about impact, maybe no teacher from this era had a wider reach eventually than the Buddha. His message traveled far beyond India, across Asia.
Absolutely. One of the most influential teachers in history. Our understanding of his life and teachings, though, it's pieced together from various sources.
Right. It's not like one single biography written at the time.
No. The core is the collection of Buddhist texts themselves. The Tipitaka, the three baskets, initially passed down orally for a long time before being written.
And they're organized, right, into monastic rules.
That's the Vinaya Pitaka. Then his teachings, discourses in the Sutta Pitaka, and more philosophical, analytical stuff in the Abhidhamma Pitaka.
And beyond those core texts.
We also have hagiographies, biographies written by followers, often much later, which tell us a lot about how his life was remembered, interpreted, and venerated.
And accounts from travelers. Like those Chinese pilgrims.
Exactly. Fas Yan Xuanzang. They came to India specifically seeking Buddhist texts, and their accounts give us invaluable outside perspectives.
So, the story of Siddhartha, the man who became the Buddha, what did the hagiographies generally tell us?
They often describe this very privileged upbringing, son of a chief, deliberately sheltered from all suffering within the palace walls.
Until that fateful journey outside.
Right, the turning point. His first journey is outside the palace, where he encounters old age, sickness, and death for the very first time.
It must have been a profound shock.
Absolutely. This exposure to the inevitability of decay and suffering shook him to his core. But then, seeing a calm, peaceful mendicant that offered a glimmer of hope, it suggested there might be a path beyond all this suffering.
So he leaves the palace, embarks on his own quest.
Yes. He tried various extreme ascetic practices first, pushing his body almost to the point of death. But he ultimately realized that wasn't the way either.
The middle path.
He abandoned those extremes, sat in meditation, and finally attained enlightenment, becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. And from then on, he taught the path he'd discovered, his Dhamma, the path of righteous living.
So what was this path? What were the core teachings the Buddha offered, especially according to the Sutta Pitaka?
Well, one key aspect was his approach. He relied on reason and persuasion, not just demanding blind belief or performing miracles. There's that famous story.
The woman grieving for her child.
Yes. He helps her understand the universality of death, not by some magical intervention, but by guiding her through her own experience to see that loss touches everyone. It's about understanding reality.
And significantly, he taught in the language of ordinary people, right? Not just the elite Sanskrit.
Exactly, making his message much more accessible. The fundamental insights he offered were, well, profound. First, the world is transient, impermanent Anicca. Everything is constantly changing.
Nothing stays the same.
Second, it's soulless anatta. There's no permanent eternal self or soul underneath it all. Nothing lasts forever in that sense either.
Okay, transient, soulless.
And third, within this transient soulless existence, suffering dukkha is an intrinsic part of the human condition. It's inherent.
That sounds pretty bleak. So what's the way out? How do you rise above this inherent suffering?
The Buddha proposed a path of moderation. The middle way. Avoid the extremes. Don't pursue harsh penance like he first tried.
But also don't just indulge in excessive worldly pleasures.
Precisely. It's finding that balance. And interestingly, in the earliest forms of Buddhism, the whole question of whether gods existed or not, it was kind of irrelevant to this path.
Really? So it wasn't about pleasing gods?
Not fundamentally. The focus was squarely on understanding the nature of reality and suffering and finding your own way out through your own efforts. He saw the social world, things like caste and hierarchy, as human creations, not divinely ordained.
So he advised rulers, householders.
Yes, to be humane, to be ethical. He emphasized individual effort as the key to improving not just your own spiritual state, but also social relations.
And the ultimate goal. What were people striving for?
The ultimate goal is nibbana, often translated as nirvana. It literally means extinguishing the ego, extinguishing desire, and by doing that, ending the cycle of suffering and rebirth.
And this was achieved through your own agency.
Your own individual agency and righteous action. His final reported words really drive this home. Be lamps unto yourselves, as all of you must work out your own liberation. It's a very empowering message in a way.
You mentioned advice to householders. Does it get specific?
Oh, yes. The Sutta Pitaka includes advice given to a householder named Sagala. It gets quite practical, outlining mutual obligations. For instance, how masters should treat their servants and workers.
Like what?
Assigning work according to their strength, providing proper food and wages, tending to them when they're sick, sharing special treats, even granting leave. It's about ethical relationships.
And how householders should treat mendicants, monks.
With affection, keeping an open house for them, supplying their basic needs. It really shows the Dhamma wasn't just some abstract philosophy. It offered a kind of blueprint for ethical interactions in everyday life.
This practical, accessible message, it must have resonated with a lot of people.
It clearly did. It led to the formation of the Sangha, the community of disciples who dedicated themselves to following and spreading the Dhamma. They lived simply relying on alms. The monks were known as bhikkhus.
Now, initially, the song was just for men, wasn't it?
That's right. But women were later admitted. This happened after Ananda, one of the Buddha's closest disciples, strongly advocated for their inclusion.
And the first woman ordained was?
Mahapajapati Gotami, who was actually the Buddha's own foster mother. She became the first bhikkhuni, the first nun.
And many women who joined the Sangha became respected teachers themselves.
Absolutely. They were known as theras, and many attained liberation and became highly regarded teachers in their own right.
What about the social background of the followers? Was it just elites?
Not at all. That's another striking thing. Followers came from all walks of life. You had kings, wealthy merchants, ordinary householders, but also laborers, slaves, craftspeople.
And within the Sangha itself?
Crucially, within the Sangha, those former social distinctions were meant to be shed. Everyone was considered equal, having left behind their old identities.
How did the Sangha actually operate, make decisions?
It seems they adopted principles from existing forms of democratic or republican organizations that existed at the time, called ganas and sanghas. Ideally, decisions were reached through discussion and consensus.
But if they couldn't agree?
Then they resorted to voting, apparently. It suggests a quite structured participatory approach.
We get some really vivid insights into the lives and perspectives of these diverse followers, especially women, from that collection of verses.
Yes.
The Therigatha.
Yes, the Therigatha. It's part of the Sutta Pitaka, a collection of poems attributed to the early bhikkhunis, the nuns. It's unique.
And there's a story in there.
There's a fantastic story about Puna. She was formerly a slave woman, and she encounters a Brahmana priest by a river one cold morning. He's performing ritual bathing, trying to wash away his sins.
And she challenges him, a former slave challenging a Brahmana.
Directly. She questions his belief that simply washing in cold water can cleanse him of evil deeds. She humorously asks, well, if that's true, does that mean all the frogs and turtles and snakes in the river will go to heaven too?
That's brilliant.
It's sharp, witty, and a powerful critique of ritualism versus genuine ethical action delivered by someone from the very bottom of the social hierarchy to a member of the priestly elite. She basically tells him to stop bothering, save his skin from the cold, implying true purity comes from within, from your actions, not from water.
It perfectly illustrates that Buddhist emphasis on karma and individual effort over just performing rituals or relying on your birth status.
Exactly. And then the Vinaya Pitaka, the rules section, gives us even more down-to-earth details about monastic life.
Like what sort of things?
Rules about, say, how long you're allowed to keep a new blanket, 6 years apparently.
Right.
Or regulations about accepting limited amounts of food, or how to properly put away your bedding in shared monastic spaces. It shows the disciplined, practical side of actually living in the Sangha.
So putting it all together, why did Buddhism grow so rapidly back then?
Well, it seems it offered a compelling alternative for many people who were maybe dissatisfied with existing religious practices, or just confused by the rapid social changes happening around them.
And the emphasis on conduct and values over birth must have been appealing.
Hugely appealing. That, combined with the strong emphasis on metta, universal loving-kindness, or fellow feeling, and karuna, compassion for all beings, it struck a chord with many.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about ideas, debates, texts, followers. But as we hinted at the start, these beliefs didn't just exist in people's minds or on scrolls. They inspired people to build.
Precisely. Which brings us to the architecture, and particularly stupas.
Were there sacred places even before Buddhism?
Oh yes. From very early times, certain natural sites were considered sacred. Maybe impressive trees, unusual rock formations, particularly beautiful locations. Sometimes simple shrines, perhaps called chaityas, were erected at these spots. The term chaitya might even be linked to chitta, a funeral pyre or mound.
And for Buddhists, specific places became sacred because of their connection to the Buddha's life.
Exactly. His birthplace at Lumbini, the place of enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, where he gave his first sermon at Sarnath, and where he passed away, attained Mahaparinibbana at Kusnagar. These became major pilgrimage destinations. We know Emperor Asoka even marked Lumbini with a commemorative pillar.
But the stupas themselves served a different, very specific purpose, didn't they? They weren't just markers.
Right. They were built primarily to contain relics, These could be actual bodily remains of the Buddha, or sometimes objects he was believed to have used.
So the stupa, which means heap in Sanskrit, essentially became a symbol, an emblem of the Buddha himself and of Buddhism because it housed these incredibly sacred relics.
Yes. And there's a text, the Ashokavedana, that claims Asoka actually gathered the Buddha's relics, divided them up, and distributed them to major towns across his empire, ordering stupas to be built over them.
Which would explain the construction of important early sites like Barhut, Sanchi, Sarnath by around the 2nd century BCE.
Exactly. And the significance of venerating these sites is clear in texts like the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. As the Buddha is dying, his disciple Ananda asks what should be done with his remains.
And the Buddha says,
He suggests erecting stupas at 4 crossroads, stating that people who venerate them there, offering garlands, perfume, or just showing reverence and achieving a calm heart, that this act shall long be to them for a profit and joy. It really highlights their role as focal points for devotion and accumulating merit.
how were these massive structures actually funded and built? It must have been a huge undertaking.
We know a surprising amount about that from inscriptions, often found right there on the railings and pillars of the stupas themselves. They record donations.
Donations from whom? Just kings.
Kings definitely contributed. Rulers like the Satavahanas are mentioned, but also wealthy guilds like, say, ivory workers, and, fascinatingly, hundreds and hundreds of donations from ordinary individuals.
Really? Ordinary people?
Yes. Men and women. The inscriptions often list their names, where they came from, sometimes their occupations, even names of their relatives who also contributed. It cuts across different social strata. Even monks and nuns are recorded as donating, perhaps from the alms they received.
So it wasn't just top-down royal patronage. It was a real community effort, a collective act of faith.
It certainly seems that way, a very broad base of support.
What about the structure itself? How did it evolve?
It started quite simply, basically as a solid, semicircular mound of earth or brick called the akenda. Think of it like an egg or dome shape.
Right.
Over time, it became more elaborate. On top of the enda, a square railing or balcony-like structure was often added, called the harmika. This was sometimes seen as representing the abode of the gods.
And rising from that.
A mast, the yashti, often topped with one or more umbrella-like discs, the chhatri. These umbrellas were ancient symbols of royalty or high status, so here they signified the Buddha's spiritual sovereignty or the protection offered by the Dhamma.
And there was usually a railing around the whole thing.
Yes, a fence or railing called the Vedika enclosed the sacred space, separating it from the ordinary world. Early stupas, like the great ones at Sanchi and Barhut, had relatively plain mounds initially.
But the decoration was elsewhere.
Yes, the railings, and especially the gateways, the toranas, at the 4 cardinal directions, were incredibly richly carved. They almost look like carved wood translated into stone.
And the ritual involved walking around it.
Yes, the key act of worship was circumambulation, walking clockwise around the stupa, keeping the sacred mound always on your right. This path is called the Pradakshina path. Later stupas, like the one at Amaravati, would become even more elaborate, with carvings covering the surface of the mound itself.
Okay, this brings us to a really interesting, maybe slightly sad part of the story. How these sites fared in the modern era, the 19th century, when they were sort of rediscovered by British officials, archaeologists. And it's a story with 2 very different outcomes for Amaravati and Sanchi.
It really is a tale of 2 stupas. The ruins at Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh were actually noticed earlier, back in 1796, by a local Raja. He was apparently looking for building stone for a temple and maybe hoping to find treasure.
Not exactly archaeological preservation in mind.
Not at all. Later, British officials started visiting. Colin Mackenzie made drawings and reports in the early 1800s, but they weren't widely published or acted upon immediately.
Then came Walter Elliot in 1854.
Right. And he began systematically collecting the carved slabs and sculptures, transporting many of them off to Madras, and eventually some ended up in the British Museum in London. They became known as the Elliot Marbles.
So he recognized it was important.
He did recognize it as a magnificent Buddhist stupa, yes. But the practice of simply removing the sculptures continued. Other officials took pieces, sometimes just to decorate their gardens. The site was being dismantled.
Was there any pushback against this?
Yes, crucially. An archaeologist named H. Cole, who became involved later in the century, argued fiercely against this. He called it a suicidal and indefensible policy.
What did he propose instead?
He was a strong advocate for in situ preservation, leaving the original artifacts on the site where they belong, and using plaster casts if museums wanted copies. A very modern perspective, really.
But his plea didn't save Amaravati.
Sadly, no. It largely failed for Amaravati. Maybe because it was discovered earlier, before these principles of preservation were widely understood or accepted, maybe the scale of removal was already too great.
And the result?
Today, the site of the Great Stupa at Amaravati is described as basically an insignificant little mound totally denuded of its former sculptural glory. Most of its art is scattered in museums around the world.
A real tragedy. But Sanchi had a different fate.
Fortunately, yes. Sanchi in Madhya Pradesh was discovered by Europeans in 1818, and crucially, its main structures, the Great Stupa and others, were much more intact.
And the idea of preservation took hold there.
It did, largely thanks to the efforts of successive archaeological surveyors and, very importantly, the rulers of the local princely state, Bhopal.
The Begums of Bhopal.
Exactly. Shah Jahan Begum and her successor, Sultan Jehan Begum. They provided essential funding for the careful restoration and preservation work carried out in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They even funded a museum and a guest house specifically for the archaeologists working there, like Sir John Marshall.
Marshall dedicated his big volumes on Sanchi to Sultan Jehan Begum, didn't he?
He did. It shows the vital role their patronage played. Sanchi's survival is partly luck. It somehow escaped the attention of railway contractors looking for ballast stone, unlike some other sites. But it's also due to these wise decisions promoting in situ preservation, championed by figures like Cole and supported crucially by the Bhopal rulers.
So Sanchi stands today largely intact, allowing us to really marvel at the sculpture, especially on those gateways and railings, which is what captivated those early Europeans in the first place, even if they took pieces away from Amaravati.
Absolutely. And understanding this sculpture, this is where knowing the text becomes so invaluable again. Art historians constantly compare the visual evidence with descriptions or stories found in the Buddhist literature.
You mean like identifying scenes?
Exactly. You might see what looks like just a charming rural scene, some huts, trees, people. But by comparing it with Jataka tales, the stories of the Buddha's previous lives.
You realize it's a specific story.
Right. Like a famous panel at Sanchi is identified as depicting a scene from the Vesantara Jataka, a story about an incredibly generous prince who gives away everything, even his wife and children, before becoming the Buddha.
Wow. It makes you wonder if ancient storytellers might have used similar visual aids, like painted scrolls.
It's very possible. There's speculation they might have used scrolls called karnachitras, literally pictures for moving or storytelling. The Sanchi panels might reflect that tradition.
And then there's the deliberate use of symbols, especially for the Buddha himself.
Yes, in the earliest phases of Buddhist art, sculptors often avoided depicting the Buddha directly in human form. So you need to understand the symbolism, which often comes from knowing the stories of his life, the hagiographies.
So an empty seat under a tree.
That represents his enlightenment at Bodh Gaya, his meditation. It's not just an empty chair. It signifies his presence through his achievement.
And a stupa carving.
Can symbolize his Mahaparinibbana, his final passing away.
And the wheel, that's a famous one.
The wheel represents his first sermon at Sarnath, where he set in motion the wheel of Dharma, the teachings.
So these aren't literal pictures. They're symbolic representations drawing on key events. You need the backstory, the text, to read the art properly.
Precisely. But what's also fascinating about Sanchi is that it's not only illustrating Buddhist texts, it seems to incorporate other elements, maybe from popular, local, or even pre-Buddhist traditions.
And what kind of elements?
A really prominent example is the figure of the Shalabhanjika. It's a recurring motif of a woman, often quite voluptuous, gracefully holding onto a tree branch, sometimes shown swinging from it.
And her touch makes the tree flower.
That's the tradition associated with her. Her touch brings fertility, makes the tree blossom, or bear fruit. This figure isn't typically found in core Buddhist narrative texts.
So where does she come from?
She's likely an older auspicious symbol, maybe associated with fertility goddesses or nature spirits that was widely recognized and considered lucky. And she gets integrated into the decoration of this Buddhist monument.
So it suggests that the people building and donating to the stupa brought their existing beliefs and auspicious symbols with them, enriching the visual world of Buddhism.
Exactly. It shows that Buddhism didn't exist in a vacuum. It interacted with and absorbed elements from the wider culture.
What else do we see? Animals?
Lots of animals. Beautifully carved elephants, horses, monkeys, cattle. Some are clearly part of Jataka tales, where the Buddha was born as an animal. Others seem included just to create lively, vibrant scenes. And often, they probably carried symbolic meaning too. Elephants, for instance, are often associated with strength, wisdom, and royalty.
And there's another recurring female figure, often with lotuses and elephants pouring water over her.
Yes. That motif is fascinating. Art historians often identify her as either Maya, the Buddha's mother, whose birth story involves auspicious signs like lotuses and elephants, or as Gajalakshmi, the popular goddess of good fortune and prosperity, who is traditionally depicted in exactly this way.
So, which one is it?
It's possible that for the devotees venerating the stupa, she could have represented both. They might have seen resonances between the popular goddess and the story of the Buddha's miraculous birth. It shows a blending of traditions again.
There are also serpents, nagas.
Yes, serpent deities or nagas are another motif clearly derived from popular, perhaps very ancient Indian traditions, often associated with water, fertility, and protection. They aren't always directly linked to Buddhist narratives in the texts.
And this confused some early viewers.
It did. James Ferguson, an influential early historian of Indian architecture, wasn't deeply familiar with Buddhist texts when he first studied Sanchi. Seeing all the tree motifs, like the Bodhi tree, and these prominent serpent carvings, he actually concluded, incorrectly, that Sanchi must have been a center of tree and serpent worship, rather than primarily Buddhist.
It really underscores how crucial having the textual context is for accurate interpretation. You can't just look at the pictures in isolation.
Absolutely. And while we're talking visuals, we should briefly mention other related art forms, like the stunning paintings in the Ajanta caves.
Also depicting Jataka stories.
Yes, many scenes from the Jatakas, but also depictions of courtly life, everyday activities. They are remarkable for their vibrancy and use of techniques like shading to create a sense of three-dimensionality, even from centuries later than early Sanchi.
Okay, so we've seen the early development, the debates, the rise of Jainism and Buddhism, the building of stupas. But things kept evolving, right? Especially as we move closer to the Common Era around the 1st century CE.
Definitely. We see significant shifts in religious ideas happening around this time, leading to what we often recognize as new traditions or major developments within existing ones.
In Buddhism, this is when Mahayana Buddhism really starts to develop.
Yes, there's a noticeable shift in emphasis. While the earlier focus was very much on individual self-effort to achieve nibbana,
The Mahayana introduces something else.
a greater emphasis on the idea of a savior. The Buddha himself comes to be increasingly seen not just as a teacher who showed the path, but as a powerful, compassionate being who can actively help others achieve salvation.
And this is linked to the Bodhisattva concept.
Exactly. The ideal of the Bodhisattva emerges and becomes central. These are enlightened beings who, out of immense compassion, choose to delay their own final nirvana, their final release, in order to stay in the world and help all other suffering beings reach enlightenment first.
That's a very different feel from be lamps unto yourselves.
It is. It introduces a strong element of grace, of help from enlightened beings. And alongside this conceptual shift, this is also the era when image worship becomes really important in Buddhism.
So actually sculpting and venerating images of the Buddha himself and these bodhisattvas, like that Buddha image from Mathura.
Precisely. That becomes a central practice for many Buddhists. This new way, with its emphasis on bodhisattvas and salvation through grace, came to be called Mahayana, literally the great vehicle, suggesting it offered a path capable of carrying more beings to liberation.
And they call the older tradition.
They referred to the earlier tradition, with its focus on self-effort and the arhat ideal, the individual who achieves nibbana for themselves, as Hinayana, the lesser vehicle. It was somewhat derogatory.
But followers of that older way didn't call themselves that.
No, they generally preferred and still prefer terms like Theravada, meaning the way of the elders, emphasizing their connection to the original teachings of the Buddha and his immediate disciples.
And while Mahayana Buddhism is developing, are similar ideas emerging in what we now call Hinduism.
Yes, very much so. You see similar ideas revolving around a chosen deity, a savior figure, developing strongly in traditions that would coalesce into Puranic Hinduism, particularly Vaishnavism, centered on the god Vishnu, and Shaivism, focused on the god Shiva.
And the key relationship here is
There's a growing emphasis on the bond between the devotee and their chosen god, a relationship often visualized and experienced as intense love and devotion, the concept of bhakti.
So in Vaishnavism, this crystallizes around Vishnu and his avatar.
Exactly. Cults grew around the idea that Vishnu periodically incarnates himself, takes an avatar whenever the world falls into disorder, to restore balance and righteousness. 10 main avatars became widely recognized over time.
And this helped unify different traditions.
Yes, by recognizing various popular local deities as forms or avatars of the one great god Vishnu, it helped integrate and unify diverse regional traditions under a larger Vaishnava umbrella. That classic image of Vishnu's Varaha, or boar, avatar rescuing the earth goddess from the primordial ocean is a powerful visual representation of this saving function.
And Shaivism focused on Shiva.
Shaivism revolved around the worship of Shiva, who is seen as the supreme being in many complex roles: destroyer, creator, ascetic, householder. He's often worshipped in the symbolic aniconic form of the linga.
But also shown in human form.
Yes, and often depicted in intricate human forms, along with deities associated with him, like his consort Parvati, or the powerful warrior goddess Durga, who is sometimes seen as a manifestation of the supreme feminine energy Shakti.
And understanding these complex images requires.
It requires knowing the stories, the mythology. The sculptures use a rich vocabulary of symbols, specific types of headwear, ornaments, the ayudhas, the weapons or attributes they hold, like Shiva's trident or Vishnu's discus. Even their postures, asanas, and hand gestures, mudras, all convey specific aspects of the deity's nature and the stories associated with them.
And where do we find these stories?
The stories behind these deities, their exploits, their avatars, are largely found in the Puranas. These are vast collections of myths, legends, genealogies, cosmology, and religious instructions. Compiled mainly by Brahmanas, starting around the mid-1st millennium CE, so overlapping with the later Buddhist developments we discussed.
And importantly, unlike the earlier restricted Vedic texts.
Exactly. The Puranas were generally composed in relatively simple Sanskrit verse. They were intended to be recited, heard, and understood by a much wider audience, explicitly including women and Shudras, who were traditionally excluded from direct access to Vedic learning. They played a huge role in popularizing these devotional forms of Hinduism.
How did these ideas spread?
Through all sorts of interactions, wandering priests and storytellers reciting the Puranas, merchants and travelers carrying images and ideas along trade routes, pilgrims visiting sacred sites. The worship of Vasudeva Krishna, for example, seems to have originated in the Mathura region and spread widely from there.
So alongside the stupas being built, we now see the emergence of the first temples, specifically to house these images of gods and goddesses.
Yes, exactly. While stupas enshrined relics, temples were built as the dwelling place, the house, griha, for the deity's image, murti.
What did early temples look like?
The earliest structural temples were often quite simple. Typically a small, square inner sanctum called the garbhagriha, literally the womb house where the main image was installed. It usually had just one doorway for the worshipper to approach and view the deity.
And they became more complex over time.
Much more complex. Later developments included adding a tall superstructure or tower, the shikara, built directly over the garbhagriha, making the temple visible from afar. Walls were decorated with sculptures. Eventually, temples grew into vast complexes with large assembly halls, mandapas, massive boundary walls, imposing gateways, gopurams in the south, and even sophisticated water tanks or systems for ritual use.
But there was another tradition of making sacred spaces, even earlier than structural temples, carving into rock.
Yes, a fascinating and incredibly skillful tradition of rock-cut architecture, creating artificial caves, shrines, and monasteries directly out of hillsides or cliffs. This tradition existed in India even before the rise of Buddhism and Hinduism as we know them. Asoka, back in the 3rd century BCE, commissioned caves carved out of hard rock for the Ajivika ascetics we mentioned earlier.
And this tradition continued.
It continued and culminated in some absolutely breathtaking achievements much later. Perhaps the most famous example is the Kailashnatha Temple at Ellora, from around the 8th century CE.
That's the one carved entirely from a single piece of rock.
Yes, an entire, massive, multi-story temple complex, complete with courtyards, shrines, halls, and intricate sculptures, all carved downwards out of the solid basalt cliff face. It's not built, it's excavated, sculpted from the living rock, an astonishing feat of engineering and artistry.
There's a story about the chief sculptor.
Yes, there's a recorded inscription where the chief architect or sculptor, upon its completion, expresses his own amazement, something like, "Oh, how did I manage to make it?" Even he was awestruck by the result.
You could understand why. It's truly mind-boggling.
It really is one of the wonders of the ancient world.
So we have this incredible wealth of surviving visual material from this long period. The architecture of stupas and temples, rock-cut caves, the sculpture, the paintings like at Ahanta. It's amazing. But as rich as it is, can we really see everything? I mean, can we fully grasp what these images and buildings truly meant to the people who created them, lived with them, worshipped with them, maybe 2,000 years ago?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a genuine challenge of historical interpretation. We already touched on how 19th century European viewers, coming from their own cultural background, sometimes struggled with Indian art.
Finding multi-limbed or animal-headed deities grotesque or strange?
Exactly. Because it was so alien to their artistic traditions, which were heavily influenced by classical Greece and Rome, with its focus on naturalistic human forms.
And they often compared Indian art to Greek sculpture.
Yes, that was their familiar yardstick, their gold standard. And often, Indian work was judged as somehow inferior or less developed unless it seemed to show Greek influence. Like certain early Buddha and Bodhisattva images from the Gandhara region in northwest India, which clearly show Hellenistic stylistic features, the drapery, the facial features.
So they liked those because they looked more familiar.
Pretty much. It's a classic example of how we tend to use our own familiar cultural benchmarks when encountering something unfamiliar from the past, which can lead to misinterpretations or biased judgments.
And there's another challenge, right? Sometimes the visual evidence doesn't perfectly or unambiguously match the textual descriptions we have.
Right. The magnificent rock-cut relief sculpture at Mahabalipuram, down south near Chennai, is a perfect example. It's huge, incredibly dynamic, teeming with figures, gods, humans, animals.
But historians don't agree on what story it actually depicts.
No, there are two main interpretations. One view is that it shows the descent of the Ganga River from the heavens to earth, with the natural cleft in the rock cleverly used to represent the river flowing down and figures reacting all around it.
Okay. And the other view?
The other main interpretation is that it depicts the story of the hero Arjuna from the Mahabharata epic, performing intense penance to obtain weapons from the goddess Shiva. They point to the central ascetic figure standing on one leg as evidence.
So with no definitive inscription or label?
The interpretation remains open to debate. Both readings are plausible based on different textual sources and visual cues. It highlights the difficulty in achieving absolute certainty when interpreting complex visual narratives from the distant past.
And finally, we just have to acknowledge how much is simply lost forever, don't we?
Absolutely. Think of all the rituals, the daily practices, the specific local beliefs, the personal religious experiences of ordinary people. So much of that was never recorded in permanent stone or written down in texts that survived.
Especially everyday life, special occasions.
Right. Communities might have had incredibly vibrant traditions, songs, dances, temporary decorations, but they might not have felt the need or had the means to create lasting monumental records of everything. What we have, as amazing and precious as it is, it really is just the tip of the iceberg.
A precious tip, though.
Oh, definitely a precious tip.
Absolutely. And what a journey it's been thinking through this. We've traveled across, 1,000 years of incredible intellectual ferment, artistic energy in India.
Yeah, seeing how ancient thinkers grappled with those huge questions about life, death, reality.
How traditions like Jainism and Buddhism offered these radical new paths, often focused on individual effort and ethics.
And how these powerful ideas weren't just confined to debates or texts, but were physically built into the landscape. Through these breathtaking structures like stupas and temples and the sculptures that adorned them.
With Sanchi standing as this remarkable survivor, allowing us to glimpse so much of that world.
It really highlights how dynamic religious and philosophical thought was back then. How different ideas interacted, borrowed from each other, competed. And how deeply beliefs can shape the tangible world, taking enduring form in stone.
Understanding this past. It's not just about memorizing names and dates, is it?
Yeah.
It feels more about appreciating the incredible diversity of ways humans have sought meaning, how they've depicted their world, and how they created these lasting expressions of what they held sacred.
Yeah, it shows the profound power of belief systems, shaping everything from, abstract philosophical concepts right down to inspiring people to carve entire temples out of single mountains.
So maybe a final thought to leave people with. Thinking back to those contrasting faiths we discussed. Sanchi, so carefully preserved in situ, largely thanks to local rulers and later archaeological principles. And Amaravati, whose incredible sculptures were scattered across the globe and the site itself diminished. What is that story, that difference in preservation and loss? What does it maybe tell you, the listener, about how we decide whose history gets privileged? Which parts of the past we deem valuable enough to protect, and maybe more importantly, what we lose, what voices get silenced when we don't make that effort?